Welcome to Rex's Bible Minute, a weekly video where we talk about Jesus, Christianity, and anything along those lines. We are in week number 3 of our study of the Exodus story. If you haven't watched any of the prior ones, I would suggest maybe stopping here and going and checking those out, because we do these studies sequentially, meaning we're kind of expecting you to have seen the ones that came before to understand the context of what we're talking about. So these first ones, though, are really heavy on the context. We're going to talk about it probably a little more than most people would like, just to make sure that we're all on the same page here and we're seeing the message that God has for us. As always, I've said in the last two messages, 2 studies, the point of this whole thing, the message that's trying to be communicated is very simple: that God is the sovereign, all-powerful, indisputable ruler of the universe, and He cares about His people to the point that He acts in terrifyingly powerful ways on their behalf. That's the whole point, right? We've said it a lot. We're going to keep saying it a lot, and we're going to see it again today. That is the MO. That is the message that is trying to be communicated. That God is undisputable. He is all-powerful, and that there's no challengers to His throne, and that He has a people He cares about. He chooses to care about them. He doesn't have to, but He does. And because He cares about them so much, He loves them so much, that He acts in terrifyingly powerful ways on their behalf for their benefit, right? A couple things like we talked about last week. I'm going to breeze through these real quick. The literary considerations. It is not a document. The book of Exodus is not a document to be considered a historical documentation, meaning it wasn't put together to record every single little detail that happened for the record's sake, but it's also not just a myth or a story that the facts are just kind of loose. It's a movie based on a true story. There are things that were omitted because it didn't help tell the story, communicate the message, and there are some things that are left gray, but it's still based on a true historical event. So keep that in mind, and it's also written with the expectation that you have a working knowledge of who the people of Israel are and their origins in the book of Genesis. The 3 A's that we look at for anything that we read: who wrote it, who are they writing to, and why. The author, audience, and agenda. It's pretty well accepted that Moses is either in part or fully responsible for the book of Exodus. We're dating this between the 1300s and 1500s BC, so we're talking a long time ago. And the agenda, why is he writing? Again, it's to communicate the message we just talked about, that God is the all-powerful, sovereign, indisputable ruler of the universe, and He cares about His people so much so that He acts in terrifyingly powerful ways on their behalf. And He's writing to each new generation of God's people, of Israel, and then to us today as Christians. But that's why He was writing, because this message needed to communicate it and be displayed through God's actions on the people's behalf as they were freed from slavery in Egypt. The outline, again, we're going to be dealing with the first 12 chapters or so, 12, 15 chapters. So we've already covered the historical narrative. That's the section we're in. Chapters 1 through 18 is a historical narrative. We've covered the oppression of Israel. That was chapter 1. Now we're going to be in the section about Moses' calling, about him going from how he started to where he's actually going to be used by God. So that's chapters 2 through 6. That's where we're at right now. And just very, very briefly, the historical context. We're dealing in a time when Egypt is most likely recovering from what's called the Hyksos period, where ethnic Egyptians finally reunited both the northern and southern kingdoms from the hands of Canaanite Hyksos peoples in the north to start the new kingdom era, meaning that there was a lot of racism and prejudice against any Canaanite people groups, which the Hebrews most definitely were. And so if you're curious about how the Israelites and the Hebrew people got to Egypt, go read the end of Genesis or watch the last 2 weeks' episodes. But I'll save that for your own research. All right. Now, the last piece of context before we dig into this is you have to remember that at the end of chapter 1, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, had issued an edict saying that any male Hebrew child born was to be killed. And this was his attempt at people control, at population control. It doesn't make a lot of sense as far as like it having the result that he's wanting, but he's issued it. So any male Hebrew children are pretty much doomed to death unless they get hidden. So that takes us to where we're going to pick up today. So starting in verse 1 of chapter 2, it says, "Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the river bank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young women walked beside her. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, 'This is one of the Hebrews' children.' Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?' And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Go.' And so the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages.' And so the woman took the child and nursed him. And when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, because, she said, 'I drew him out of the water.'" The Bible has a difficult teaching in it. It has a lot of difficult teachings in it, but from an American perspective, it has one that's really hard for a lot of us to just kind of be okay with. Jesus was asked with a question about civil disobedience. He was given a coin and asked about paying taxes, something that the people in his day, especially the Hebrew people, were very upset about. It was keeping them in bondage. It was oppressing them. The taxes were too much. It was a load on the people that they couldn't bear. And Jesus was given a Roman coin, and that coin had Caesar's face on it. And he famously said, when he was asked the question about paying taxes, he said, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar, and give to God what is God's." What he was saying there was, in a nutshell, the principle of how a person of faith should view civil disobedience. We give to those governments what they deserve. We obey them as far as we can. And that line is when we start giving what is God's to the governments. And so what that means essentially is you don't compromise, and as far as it causes you to compromise your faith or causes you to sin. And that's all the way to the point of death. If you read the New Testament and you read Paul's advice and the apostles' advice on how to handle the rough situations that the disciples find themselves in, if you read the Revelation, you see over and over that it's expected that they're willing to be good, obedient citizens of their governments all the way to the point of death, as long as it doesn't cause them to compromise their faith or to enter into sin. Last week, we saw Pharaoh, the Caesar of his day, mandate evil. He ordered that baby boys be murdered. And at first, he tried to have the Hebrew midwives do it for him, and they disobeyed. Because I think we all can hopefully collectively understand and agree, murdering babies, that's sin, right? That is compromising your faith. God does not want that. He does not want us to be that blindly obedient that we'd be like, yeah, okay, we'll kill babies because the government told us to. No, that's not okay. That is not God's heart. And so these midwives, they disobey, and God blesses them for it. But even with their disobedience, that didn't stop evil. The mandate still existed. Hebrew babies were being killed. And Moses' mom, I'm sure she felt trapped. I'm sure she felt just as stuck and frustrated and angry and scared as she possibly could be, because she was powerless to stop the evil that her government was committing, to stop the evil that was around her. She couldn't change it. But we see that God's heart is for justice. And so it's up to us to be bringers of justice where we can, and trust in God's justice where we can't change it. But we're never to be people who are just go along with it. That's not what we see here. We see that the midwives disobeyed and God blesses them. And we see that God worked through Moses' mother's disobedience. Now, if you remember in our study of Revelation, if you haven't watched it, I highly recommend it. Not just because I did it, but because, I think it's very informative. But one of the themes over and over about it is that God is going to make things right in the end. Like, even if things completely fall apart and go as bad as they possibly can here in this life and on this world, God's eventually going to make things right. He is the great judge. He is going to bring about justice. And so for us as people who sometimes face situations where evil has power over us, we have to remember that we need to be people who seek to bring justice where we can and trust in God's justice where we can't. And so Moses' mom sees this evil. She has this baby boy. She knows that his life is at risk. And after 3 months, she knows she can't keep him. And she doesn't know what else to do. And so she falls into a common trait we see of people in her day, and really for another several thousand years after. She abandons her child. Now, it's not abandonment in the Roman sense. Like, Romans would set their children out in city squares, in public places, and those children, 9 times out of 10, if they didn't die from an animal or something like that, or exposure, they would be taken and used as sex slaves or just slaves in general. That was the fate of Roman exposure. What Moses' mom is doing is something very different. She's rolling the dice that somebody would find her child and save it. Most likely based on a famous story from 1,000 years prior that would have been circulating, the legend of Sargon. Now, we don't know if she knew this story or not, but basically it has kind of the same beginning. There was a king in Mesopotamia about 2300 BC, so about 1,000 years earlier, depending on you date this story. And in the legend of Sargon, Sargon is placed in a red basket that is sealed up, and he's placed in a river. And eventually that basket is found by somebody who adopts him and saves him, right? And we see that people being adopted and saved from exposure was, I'm not going to say it was common, but it did happen. Like, we have records of people with really weird names that indicate that they were saved from exposure. Like, we found a guy named He of the Dog's Mouth, indicating that maybe the dog, like, he was saved from a dog's mouth, or the river has compensated me. The baby was pulled from a river. So we see that she's not just acting like bizarrely. Like, there's some cultural precedence for why she chooses to do this. It's not just her trying to kill her child. Like, it's her hoping, right, that somebody somewhere would find the child and be able to save it further on down the river. And so she makes this basket out of reeds and bitumen and tar. Now, she knows what she's doing here, right? Like, the Egyptian riverboats are made of the same thing. So this isn't just like she found a basket in the back and threw him in it and chucked him in the river. Like, no, she made a little boat. Like, she sealed it. She tried to make it waterproof, and she would have known how to do this, right? So she puts him in the water. It takes off. Now, big sister Miriam, she wants to see what happens. And so Miriam follows the basket down the river, and eventually it goes to a bathing spot for the Pharaoh's family, for Egyptian royalty. And so Pharaoh's daughter goes out, and she's starting to clean and whatnot, and her attendants are there. And all of a sudden she sees the basket, and so she sends one of her attendants to go get it. She brings it. She sees it's a baby, and the baby's crying. And in that moment, either she has a moment of weakness, or there's other things going on in her life. Like, maybe she couldn't have children, or was forbid from having children, or we don't know. But we know that she has pity on the baby, and she decides she wants to keep it. Now, as soon as she decides to keep it, we don't know if she said that aloud or what, but we know that big sis Miriam jumps at the opportunity, right? Common practice was for wealthy people to have wet nurses for their children, people who would basically raise the child and feed the child so that they didn't have to. And so Miriam jumps out and says, "Would you like me to get a Hebrew to wet nurse this baby for you, to take care of the baby for you?" And she jumped at the opportunity. Of course. And she said, "I'll pay the nurse to take care of this baby." And so typically if a wet nurse took charge of an infant, she would keep the child for about 3 years. And so we have to give kudos to Miriam. This was not an easy thing for a child to do. She jumped at an opportunity. She didn't let fear hold her back. There was an opportunity for her family to be reunited, and she took it. She didn't hold back for fear of her life because maybe, this was something that didn't need to be out, that the Pharaoh's daughter didn't want people to see or to know about this child. Maybe she would have had Miriam killed or something to keep it a secret. We don't know that, and she didn't know that. But she didn't let that stop her from acting. And so she jumped up and she says, hey, let me get you this wet nurse. And the wet nurse she goes and gets is actually Moses' mother. And so Moses' mom is now paid to raise her own child, whereas before she would have had the child murdered. She was being protected by Pharaoh's daughter. And after 3 years probably, she brings the baby back to Pharaoh's daughter and she names him. And she names him Moses. And this is a really cool name because it's both Hebrew and Egyptian. On the Egyptian side, Moses, typically spelled M-S, it would have meant son or fathered one. We see the name a lot. It's the derivative of the name Tutmos or Ahmos or Ramses even. Like those are all derivatives of this name M-S. It means son or fathered one. But in Hebrew, it also is a verb that means to pull out or to retrieve. And so we see one who is fathered and retrieved and this is done by Pharaoh's daughter, that she saves this child. And so she raises this child as her own, we think. Right now, there's no indication in the Bible that Moses was given special education or higher education. There really isn't. We see that she raises him, but it would have been obvious that he was a Hebrew baby. Like when she opens it, it's a Hebrew. Like if I look at an infant, unless it looks very different, a lot of infants kind of look the same, right? Especially young ones. Their things are just kind of swollen, and they have a little bit of hair, so you can tell they have dark hair, light hair. Like babies aren't necessarily super indistinguishable from each other based on race. But the Pharaoh's daughter tells immediately, because the Canaanite people group looked different than the Egyptians. The records that we have show that Egyptians were typically darker skinned with dark hair. A lot of the evidence about Canaanites at this time showed that they had red hair, actually, and were a little bit lighter skinned. Still very much, Middle Eastern people, so don't picture a white guy. Like that's not what this was. But there's paintings and statues and stuff of Canaanites from this time, and they're typically painted with red hair and with lighter skin. David, several hundred years later, is described as being ruddy, meaning he had red hair. Right? So Moses would have stood out in the palace or wherever this daughter lived. The other thing to keep in mind, too, is that just because she's Pharaoh's daughter doesn't mean that she was necessarily privileged herself. Pharaoh kept harems. As a matter of fact, if you remember from the Genesis story, when Abraham goes to Egypt, Pharaoh tries to take his wife into his harem. Okay, like that, Pharaoh did that. And so Pharaoh probably had a lot of children, and he may not have even known this daughter. Even the concubines' children were taken care of, but that doesn't necessarily mean they were given everything Pharaoh could offer. And so there's no guarantee that Moses was raised really, really fancily or rich. I mean, there's a good chance Moses was raised as a pet, in a sense. Like he was the Hebrew that this daughter kept around for companionship. We don't know. There's no indication that he was given special education. And if you step back and really think about it, that may have been a temptation for him, right? If he was given the absolute best of the best, the way that it's sometimes taught, why would he ever go back to be with his own people? Moses jumps right in with his people when the time comes. He has their back. He cares for them. We'll see that next week, how much he cares for them. Why would he do that? I think it's because he wasn't raised as an Egyptian, but he was raised as a Hebrew pet, maybe even as a palace slave. We don't know. We know that she provided for him, but we also know that this meant he was privileged to things that other Hebrews wouldn't have been. Not necessarily that he was highly educated, but that he was exposed to the royal family. He was exposed to their culture. He was exposed to their discussions. He was exposed to their interests. It's not that he was necessarily just stuck in a corner and didn't have any access to that stuff. He definitely did if he grew up in a palace or as a Pharaoh's daughter's son. But it doesn't necessarily mean that he was highly educated and knew all about Egyptian combat, but he was definitely given an advantage in life for what would come based on his upbringing. And so that gets us to the end of today's study, where we look at the parallels between the Exodus story and the New Testament. And so last week we looked at the parallel that between Pharaoh's mandate to kill all the newborn boys and Herod's mandate to kill all the newborn boys in the district of Bethlehem. And we saw that there was a parallel between both rulers' half-hearted attempt to fix the problem through third-party means, and then when that fails, they make a full-blown mandate to kill them all, and those affected have to act. And so we saw that today Moses' mother had her child put in a river basket boat and hope that somebody would find it. Now, we don't have a direct parallel in the New Testament for that, but we see that both end up being protected by Egypt. That Jesus and his family flee to Egypt out of Herod's reach, and he stays there until Herod dies, and then they go back home. We see that Moses is raised by Pharaoh's daughter, protected from the evil that Pharaoh was committing on Hebrew boys. We see that there is so many parallels here, that God works through life situations. That's what I want you to see every single week in this situation, that with normal people, and when they're placed in these extraordinary circumstances, God works through those circumstances, ultimately to act on behalf of his people. If you have any questions or comments, reach out. Otherwise, see you next week.
It's not our house, it's not our home. We've been waiting.